everyone. It's about 6:30, so we'll start getting started with the presentation. Welcome to the GBBO webinar presentation of Pinyon Juniper Woodlands. My name is Kelly Colegrove. I'm a project manager at GBBO, and I will be your host this evening. So for those of you who have not joined us before for a webinar presentation, you are all muted and cannot be seen by myself or any of the other participants. So if you have a question, there should be a little chat option in the bottom of your screen. If you ask that, we're going to hold all questions to the end, and then we'll field them at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So tonight's presentation will be given by John Boone, who has been a research coordinator with GBBO since 1995. Some of his recent work includes elf owl monitoring, golden eagle nest studies, and radio telemetry of greater sage grouse and pinyon jays, which is what you'll be mostly hearing about tonight. To provide a little context to this pinyon jay research, I'll provide some background on pinyon juniper woodlands and birds for anyone who is unfamiliar. Pinyon juniper, or PJ habitat, is common across the southwestern United States. It is the dominant forest type in Nevada, covering over 8.6 million acres as of 2013, based on a forest inventory of Nevada. The range of juniper trees spans much of the west, reaching north into Washington, but the range of pinyon pines is much more restricted. As you can see in this image, the range in Nevada generally follows the I-80 and doesn't get into the northwest corner. The pinyon juniper landscape is considered a mosaic habitat with patches of trees interspersed among a shrub or grassland component. Here's a photo of PJ in Nevada with mostly sagebrush understory. You can see areas with more dense trees as well as large open patches. This diversity in the landscape provides a variety of food and shelter resources utilized by many different species. There's been increasing densities of pinyon juniper recorded throughout the 20th century, which has prompted management actions across the region. Pinyon juniper expansion comes in the form of PJ establishment in new areas, as well as increasing densities of trees where they already occurred. The term encroachment is often used when trees are observed establishing farther downslope than previously documented or in surrounding habitats, such as the sagebrush landscape. This is a photo from a USDA and Forest Service report on PJ expansion, which illustrates an increase in density between 1973 and 2007. In the top photo, you see mostly phase 1 and phase 2 PJ on this hillside with an almost pure shrubland at the base. Phase 1 PJ is early establishment with sparse trees. Phase 2 has more trees, but there is still an understory. Phase 3 PJ has a thicker canopy and little to no understory, which you can see in this bottom photo, along with additional establishment of trees at the base of the hillside. The cause of PJ expansion is believed to be mostly fire suppression, increased grazing, and long-term shifts in climate. Some of the documented expansion is due to reestablishment of pinyon juniper after removal by early settlers. This creates a challenge for land managers attempting to maintain habitats that reflect pre-settlement conditions or what the landscape would be like without human intervention. In some cases, the expansion of PJ has led to an overall decrease in plant diversity and understory of shrubs and grasses, having a negative impact on some species of wildlife and livestock. Trees are often removed from sagebrush habitat for conservation of sagebrush obligate species, such as the greater sage grouse, which for those of you not familiar has seen massive population declines, largely due to habitat loss. In other circumstances, decreasing fuels to mitigate wildfire is the primary reason for removal. Like many aspects of land management, there has been a lot of conflict surrounding the mitigation of pinyon juniper expansion. There are always trade-offs in the needs of different wildlife species as well as humans. Expansion is also variable across the landscape, with some areas seeing PJ loss when others are seeing increases. In Nevada, we have records of both expansion and Pinyon Jay Die Off. Here are some photos of Pinyon Jay Die Off in the Shoshone Range of central Nevada. These were taken by Sam Flake, who was a previous GBBO employee while he was working on his master's thesis on Pinyon Juniper Die Off in response to drought. Managers and researchers are actively working together to understand how both pinyon juniper range expansion and woodland reduction practices are impacting birds and wildlife that are dependent on the habitat. Pinyon and juniper trees and birds have a mutually beneficial relationship. The trees provide food and shelter for the birds, but are also reliant on the birds for seed dispersal. Clark's nutcrackers, scrub jays, and pinyon jays are particularly known for their seed dispersal. They cache or store a surplus of seeds across the landscape, and while they are surprisingly good at remembering where they buried their seeds, there are always a few that get left behind. This is an artist's rendering of caching behavior. Over 70 species of birds have been documented breeding in Pinyon Juniper Woodlands, with some species like the blue-gray gnatcatcher, black-throated gray warbler, and juniper titmouse shown here being particularly dependent. However, even with the Pinyon Juniper community, there are different attributes that benefit different species, such as tree density, age structure, distance to edge, and shrub composition, just to name a few. For example, gray flycatchers and juniper titmice have shown preference for later stage successional PJ, while gray vireo and Buick's wrens prefer a large shrub component. This graphic is from a specific study done in Colorado by Sedgwick in the mid-1980s. Without going into too much detail, it illustrates the spectrum of preferences by some pinyon juniper birds, ranging from mature trees to open areas and the presence of shrubs. Virginia's warblers preferred more mature trees with a lot of shrubs, while birds like Vesper sparrow preferred fewer trees and less shrubs, which may not be particularly surprising. And then you have a number of birds such as the black-throated gray warbler, solitary vireo, and blue-gray gnatcatcher that weren't too influenced by the presence of shrubs, but preferred more tree cover. This illustrates preferences from just one study, and the results would likely be different in a different place and time, but you can see how different species have different needs and preferences. And many birds require a mix of habitats, like the Pinyon Jay, which we will go into detail later. There's been a lot of research on pinyon juniper birds and habitat interactions, as well as pinyon juniper expansion and management. Here's a list of articles referenced in the past few slides if you are interested in further reading. So at that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to John for the feature presentation.
Okay, and you're passing the screen sharing baton over to me?
I am indeed.
Okay.
In just a second.
Okay.
Okay, you should have access.
All right. Share. All right, you should be seeing that screen. Can you see that, Kelly?
Yep.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name's John Boone, as Kelly said, and I am going to be talking tonight about pinyon jays and edge communities and Pinyon Juniper Woodlands in Nevada. And this is a story that has a lot of compelling elements. There's a star that is a very interesting and unusual bird, which is the Pinyon Jay. There's some drama in the form of a major ongoing population decline that Pinyon Jays have experienced. There is real mystery about the reasons for that decline. There's some complexity in trying to figure out the best science to come up with an answer to that mystery. There's some suspense about whether we can find a good solution that accommodates Pinyon Jays and all the other species that need our attention. And hopefully, fingers crossed, there is a potentially satisfying conclusion in the form of better and more complete ecosystem management. So, with that said, this next slide just gives you a few views of the Pinyon Jay, which I'm sure most of you listening tonight are familiar with. Our star player. For anybody who doesn't know, this bird is a year-round resident in our area, and it nearly always occurs in flocks or subsets of flocks. It has a close association with the nuts or seeds of the pinyon pine, as Kelly described. And these Pinyon Jay flocks are distributed on the landscape in a sort of spotty, spaced out way. They're not everywhere in Pinyon Juniper Woodlands. They're spread out, and lots of places don't have them at all, and other places do. And where they do occur, they're home ranges. The home ranges of these flocks are relatively complex and relatively large for a bird this size. They have parts of the home range where they like to cache seeds. They have different parts where they like to forage. They have different parts where they like to nest. And they have still different parts where they like to roost. So the scale of the home range is large. And that fact, coupled with the spotty distribution on the landscape, makes Pinyon Jays a challenging bird for designing survey programs and for doing robust kinds of data analysis. And in large part because of those challenges, there's a lot of things we don't, to this day, understand all that well about Pinyon Jays. We're starting to learn more about how they occur on the landscape, but there's lots still to uncover about how those patterns vary in different regions, about how those patterns shift with the seasons, and about how predictable a Pinyon Jay flock is from year to year to year in terms of how they use their habitat. And beyond that, there's another big thing that we don't know, which I'll mention in this slide right here. What we have in the upper left here, of course, is the range of this bird in the Intermountain West. It covers several states. And if we drill down into that a little bit more deeply using some breeding bird survey analysis in this figure in the upper right, you'll see that the distribution of Pinyon Jays is sort of broken down into the areas where they're denser, their core areas, versus their more peripheral areas. And you can see there's really a couple of major core areas for Pinyon Jays. One of them is really right here in central and eastern Nevada, and another one's down here in western New Mexico. Now, getting back to the thing that's the mystery that we really don't know much about, and that is this decline. This is breeding bird survey data of Pinyon Jay density from the 1960s up until the present day. And it's remarkable how steadily that line's going down. It seems to have leveled a bit in the last decade or so, but it's still declining. If you average all of that out, that's around a 3 or 3.5% decline per year in Nevada. Same thing is happening range-wide. And if you do the math, that means that we've lost about 80% of our Pinyon Jays over the last 50 years, and it's quite possible we lost more of them before the breeding bird survey started. The thing we don't know is why. We don't know what's causing this decline. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get deeper into the talk. However, there are some things we do know, and Kelly covered some of it really nicely. There have been changes in Pinyon Juniper Woodlands over the last half century, perhaps even more. And basically, we've transitioned from woodlands that seem to be younger and more open on average to woodlands that are generally older and denser and are stretched out over a larger area in some cases. And all of these things I have illustrated here, fire, livestock, climate change, are all potential causal factors in this. And an open question that I'll return to at the end of the talk is, what effect are these changes having on the Pinyon Jay's preferred food source, the pine nut? And might that be a contributor to the declines that we're seeing? There's some other things we know, which Kelly also covered fairly well as well, which is that that this habitat, Pinyon Juniper Woodland, is being very actively managed these days. And it's being managed primarily to benefit sagebrush obligate species like the sage grouse. These are right here in the upper left, and zoomed in a little bit on the lower left, you see what the aftermath of those treatments often look like. They tend to occur in the lower elevation areas where woodlands are thought to be expanding, and they oftentimes leave sort of a sharp demarcation between woodland and shrubland, as you see here. Now, I should mention a caveat here, and that's that Pinyon Jays have been declining for much longer than this particular type of woodland treatment has been occurring. So we really can't blame the decline on these treatments. But that said, there's still clearly a potential for these treatments, which occur at a fairly large scale, to have an impact on Pinyon Jays, maybe a negative impact, conceivably even a positive impact if they're designed correctly. And what you see in this figure to the right of the slide is a proposed removal area for Pinyon juniper trees within this orange outlined areas. And juxtaposed on the same map, you see some of GBBO's data about where Pinyon Jays occur. So you can see the red dots and the blue polygons and the yellow lines, which are flight paths, all indicate Pinyon Jay sightings. So you can see that this group of Pinyon Jays here is going to potentially be affected by this larger removal area for Pinyon Juniper Woodland, and potentially this nearby flock will be affected as well. So we don't know what the effect of these treatments are. That's an important thing that we're going to have to explore more moving into the future. GBBO has worked on Pinyon Jays for a long time, a number of years now. Some of our work, as you see illustrated here, with the mist netting, and here with the walk-in trap, and here with the captured Pinyon Jay, has focused on radio telemetry, but lots of our work has moved more and more toward observational studies. Here you see our super field biologist, Carlos, who's doing Pinyon Jay observations. And furthermore, we've collected lots of good Pinyon Jay data from our Nevada bird count, which is a statewide all bird monitoring program. So we've got lots of data collected over the years from Pinyon Jays. And I want to dive into that just a little bit first by showing you 3 or 4 just quick maps that illustrate the kinds of places where we have tended to find Pinyon Jay flocks over the years. Again, the polygons are places where flocks were seen on the ground doing things. The lines are flight paths, the yellow lines, and the dots are just where we saw smaller numbers of Pinyon Jays on the ground or in trees in a particular location. So sort of remember what these pictures look like, and I'll tell you what they have in common as I go through them. Here's one. Here's another one in a different area. It's another one in a different area. And finally, here's the last one. And what all of these have in common that you may have noticed is that Pinyon Jays appear to be focusing their activities in these kind of foothills area where the elevation is lower, where the Pinyon Juniper Woodland is typically younger and more open, and they seem to be a lot less common in these higher elevation, denser woodlands. So to put it another way and to describe it in pictures, what we're finding is that it seems like you're a lot more likely to see a Pinyon Jay in the kind of landscape that I'm pointing to here in the upper left than in the kind of landscape that you see down here in the lower right. And that's maybe a little counterintuitive because these birds are always described as Pinyon Juniper Woodland obligates, but in fact, they seem to like places that have a lot of shrubland in them too. Now, for just a handful of slides, I'm going to get into some of our analytical results. We're not going to go into those at all deeply. So if this is foreign material to anybody, there's no need to worry about it. I'm just going to touch on some of the more interesting points of what this is showing us. But those of you who are familiar with some of these approaches might find this interesting. So what we've got here is a graph, obviously, and think of this graph, think of all the space within this graph as describing all of the different diversity and variety of Pinyon Juniper woodlands that we have out on the landscape. And what we've done here is use something called principal components analysis to take all of the things we measured about the habitat, like the elevation and the tree density and lots of other things, and sort of smash those all down into an x-axis and a y-axis. Using a statistical technique. The x-axis, which we call component 1, is basically describing a gradient from areas that are lower in elevation, that are flatter, where the trees are younger, and where they're spaced out and more open, up to the higher and steeper areas where the woodlands are older, typically and denser. So that's what the x-axis is here. And within any of the elevation bands along this x-axis, you can also have areas that have less cover versus more cover, which is basically what the y-axis is describing. Now let's look at the points that are inside this graph. These light gray circles, that's a set essentially of control data, and it was chosen to illustrate all of the different kinds of diversity of habitat that we find just randomly across Pinyon Juniper Woodlands. And you see that sort of clusters together here, right? All of the points that are more brightly colored are one type of Pinyon Jay observation or another. Now, there is some overlap between the places where the Pinyon Jays are and Pinyon Juniper Woodland in general, right? But there's not a lot. What this basically says is that Pinyon Jays are not just randomly using Pinyon Juniper Woodland. They're using a very particular type or subset of Pinyon Juniper Woodland. If they were using just any old Pinyon Juniper Woodland, all of these colored points would be sitting on top of all of these gray circles, but they're not. They're distinctly offset from them. And furthermore, the places that Pinyon Jays use for caching, which are these green symbols, are fairly different from the places they use for nesting, which are these blue boxes. And the places they use for foraging are sort of somewhere in between the two. That's these pink triangles. So what we've learned here is that Pinyon Jays don't use just any old Pinyon Juniper Woodland. They have particular kinds of Pinyon Juniper Woodland that they like. And we can break that down just a little bit by summarizing some of our data, which we see here. These are called box plots. And for anybody who's not familiar with them, I'll explain as we go through each graph what they're really showing us. The first thing to point out is that each of the boxes has a line at the bottom, CO, which is our control sites. It has another line just above it called N, which are our nesting sites for Pinyon Jays. The next line up are our foraging sites called F, and then we have our caching sites at the top. Now with any one line, what we have is a box which describes where most of our data records or observations occur. And the median, or essentially the mean, of all of those observations is this line right in the middle of the box. And then out to the sides of the box, you see the less common points sort of arrayed just to see how far out they go, all the way out to the extreme outliers on the left or on the right. So here what we see with regard to elevation is that Pinyon Juniper Woodland occurs over this whole elevational range, and on average, it's at about 7,000 feet. But Pinyon Jays nest in locations that are on average about 6,500 feet, right here. They forage on average in areas that are even lower, and they cache in areas that are lower still, right? We see a similar pattern with slope. Pinyon Juniper Woodlands occur across a wide range of slopes, but Pinyon Jays are concentrated in lower slope areas, especially for caching here at the top. We see the same pattern with the density of trees, right? Caching sites occur in places where trees are very scattered. Nesting sites occur in places where the trees are denser, but still a little bit less dense than the average Pinyon Juniper Woodland. And finally, we see the most striking pattern with regard to the distance from the edge, the ecotone, the transition between sagebrush and woodland. Obviously, most Pinyon Juniper Woodland sites are not right on the edge. That's this broad array of data that we see at the bottom. But Pinyon Jays are close to the edge. They're strikingly close to the edge. So this is some interesting data we found. We're moving on now to some data that we analyzed from the Nevada bird count to create a predictive map of where we think Pinyon Jays are most likely to be versus least likely to be. So the most likely is the red, going down to orange and yellow, that's intermediate likelihood, and the green colors are a lot less likely. And I'd like to point out that we're really happy about how this is turning out, because this big hotspot in the middle of Nevada, where there's all the red, look how well it corresponds to the Breeding Bird Survey's hotspot map for Pinyon Jays right here. Similarly, the smaller hotspot from the Breeding Bird Survey data on the border with California right here corresponds really well to our other hotspot. So we feel like we're onto something with this. And if we zoomed into that predictive map, you'll see that it's telling just the same story as the previous analysis did. The Pinyon Jays are most likely to occur in these redder areas in the foothills of the mountain ranges, where we've got younger, flatter, and more open woodlands on average. So some of the data that I just showed you, some of the analysis is described in a lot more detail in a recent paper that just came out. For any of you who like this sort of thing, we'd encourage you to go get this, or any of us can provide you with a link. It's free to download. So please take a look if you're interested in that. Let's move on now from our data, from our analysis, into trying to answer the mystery that we talked about earlier. Why are Pinyon Jays declining? Well, obviously, the biggest candidate explanation is that something's changed over the last 50 years or more about the bird's habitat. And we've already talked about what those things might be. So what's kind of interesting and paradoxical is that even as Pinyon Juniper Woodland is being actively removed because it's expanded, the parts of Pinyon Juniper Woodland that these Pinyon Jays like seems to have actually decreased in extent. At least we think it has. So something about the changes in habitat quality might be responsible for these declines. And if we drill down a little bit deeper and think about how those changes might have affected the productivity of pinyon pine trees, we started to wonder, do these older, denser woodlands, are they somehow less productive? Do they produce less pine nuts for some reason? And we collected some data that you see here just for an initial sort of test of this theory. And we went out into the Desitoya Mountains, and we looked at a lot, all at the same time, within a couple of weeks, looked at a number of different pinyon pine areas, and we classified them according to how many of the trees had cones that were going to bear seeds in that year. And we got very diverse results. You could go from a place where a large minority of the trees, or even a majority of them, had productive cones on them, to another area just down the drainage where less than 10% of them had productive cones on them. And we think, let me back up. We know that, and probably many of you have heard of, these years that happen once every decade or so when all the pinyon pine trees everywhere are going crazy producing pine nuts. And that does happen. But we think what might be more important to Pinyon Jays is having access to some stands of pinyon pine trees that will reliably produce some nuts on a year-by-year basis. Because a flock can't wait 10 years for a good crop to spring up. They need to be able to rely on a food source that's there on every year. And so we're wondering if these older, denser woodlands might be less productive. We don't have an answer yet, but that's an active area of discussion and research. Now, I've mostly talked about Pinyon Jays, and I did not want to neglect, however, the fact that the title of my talk and the title of our webinar today talks about edge communities of birds, whole sets of birds, not just Pinyon Jays. So we've done, Kelly talked about that a little bit, but we've also done some analysis with our Nevada bird count data to see what the co-occurrence patterns are of several species that are notable inhabitants of this kind of landscape. And you see here we've got several species listed. Gray flycatcher, scrub jay, mountain chickadee, the warbler, the titmouse, and the vireo are all tend to be woodland species. Sage sparrow, sage thrasher, and brewer sparrow, of course, tend to be sagebrush, shrubland species. but we took our data and we did an analysis to determine whether a given species was more likely to occur in places where Pinyon Jays were, less likely to occur, or completely independent of Pinyon Jays. And for all of the pairings, we have a color-coded sort of diagram here. A blue color means that the two species involved tend to co-occur. In other words, if you know that Pinyon Jays occur in an area, let's take an example here. If you know Pinyon Jays occur in an area, then Western scrub jays are more likely to occur in that area than they would otherwise, right? So they tend to co-occur. In contrast, in areas where Pinyon Jays are, that doesn't tell you anything about how likely you are to see a sage sparrow. You see this neutral or random box down here. Now, what's really notable here for the Pinyon Jay column is that there are no negative associations. In other words, if we were to conserve the kinds of places that Pinyon Jays like, we would likely be doing some good for Western scrub jays, mountain chickadees, black-throated gray warblers, juniper titmouse, gray vireos, and we wouldn't be doing any harm to sage sparrows, sage thrashers, or brewer sparrows. That tells us something that I think is potentially important. It tells us that we need to better appreciate the richness and importance of these kind of transitional zones, because they seem to not only be preferred habitat for Pinyon Jays, but for a number of other bird species as well. And furthermore, they're not a bad thing to have on the landscape if you're a brewer sparrow or a sage sparrow. Our tendency to want to classify habitats into either woodland or shrubland has perhaps made us have a tendency to ignore the unique characteristics and the importance of some of these transition zones. In addition to these kinds of results giving us an appreciation for the biological value of these transition zones, it also gives us maybe a little bit of a vision or a roadmap for how we can do vegetation management in a way that really encompasses the health of the ecosystem, rather than being kind of tailored just toward this species or that species. And I'm going back to a slide that I showed you earlier about Pinyon Juniper treatments as they typically occur on the landscape now. We oftentimes end up with a pattern like this, or like this, and it doesn't take much imagination to realize that what's happened here is that we've created more shrubland habitat, but we basically eliminated the transition zone. Better, perhaps, vegetation management would find a way to create more sagebrush habitat while preserving transition zones, and in doing so could potentially enhance the whole ecosystem for Pinyon Jays, for other birds that use this landscape, for sage grouse, and thereby to move us closer to this ideal of real ecosystem management. Now, how do we get from where we are now to that vision? Well, there's going to be a lot of steps along the way, a lot of learning that has to be done, a lot of trial and error perhaps, but this was an important step. A couple of years ago, the representatives from all of the major resource management agencies, along with Great Basin Bird Observatory and some other NGOs, got together and formed the Pinyon Jay Working Group. And over the course of a couple of years, we generated and published this conservation strategy for the Pinyon Jay. This is freely available. If anybody's interested, you can go to this URL or simply search out the title and you'll find it easily. This has really had the effect over the last 6 or 8 months that it's been out of helping to put Pinyon Jays on the map of land managers, and there's a lot more interest now, which is a great thing, in accommodating the needs of this particular bird and vegetation management planning. So that's a great first step. Beyond that, there's a lot of data that still need to be collected before we get to a point where we can say really firm things, not only about the kinds of habitat this bird likes, but whether those patterns hold over large areas, how they change with the seasons, how consistent they are from year to year. And we need and ask for your help in helping to record that data. And we've created a citizen science app, very easy to use. Kelly's going to talk about it just a little bit in a moment. And what you see illustrated here are just some of the data that have come in from citizen scientists using this app over just the last couple of months, I think, maybe even less than that. And you can see that there's data associated with each observation about the behavior of the bird and the size of the flock and some other things. So if anybody would like to be part of solving this mystery about why these birds are declining and how we can best help them and how we can best help to conserve edge communities and the biological richness of these transitional zones, please let us know. Please do the things that Kelly's about to describe to you to try this app out. And anytime you're out in the field, it'll be there on your phone and you can contribute to this data set. So with that said, a lot of agencies have helped fund our Pinyon Jay focus studies and our Nevada bird count. And they're all just up here for acknowledgement. And we've had some great field techs over the years as well who are listed. So we just want to make sure that we acknowledge all of the people who've helped get us this far. And I want to thank you for your attention. I don't know if Kelly's going to go into discussing our app directly or if we're going to have an interlude for questions, but either way, at some point before the webinar is over, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, let's do an interlude for questions, just in case there are people that have time restrictions and don't feel they need to listen to the citizen science portion. So far, we don't have, oh, we do have some questions. Just a comment, John B. Free mentioned that he did a Pinyon Jay study in Baker years ago. So
oh, yes. That's part of that contributed to the data that were in that first set of, in that published paper, actually. And you were acknowledged in that paper for helping with that study. So thanks in advance. I remember that well. That was our first focused Pinyon Jay study out in the Baker area.
And then we have a question from DP, which I'm guessing are initials. So is the federal land's choice really sage grouse versus Pinyon Jays?
No, we don't think so. We think that it's a big landscape out there. We think there are probably lots of ways to construct and design vegetation management projects that meet the goal of helping sage grouse, and either are at least neutral for Pinyon Jays or may help them as well. It just requires knowing enough about the needs of all of the relevant species and understanding that in some areas we might choose to focus on sage grouse qualities, some areas we might choose to focus on Pinyon Jays, and to put all of that together into sort of a big picture strategy and concept is what we're after here. So it wouldn't be really an improvement to change from a focus just on sage grouse to a focus just on Pinyon Jays, or to have them in some sense fighting with each other for conservation attention. The vision that we'd love to see happen and love to facilitate is this concept of ecosystem management. What do you do that makes the whole ecosystem healthier, and in doing so benefits all of the species involved? And of course there are some trade-offs in this place versus that place, but that's the big vision.
John Dunn mentioned to the south of Mono Lake, Pinyon Jays can consistently be found in Jeffrey pines. How does this fit in?
It's a great question. Certainly Pinyon Jays occur in areas that do not have pinyon pines in them. They tend to be in those more marginal areas of the bird's range, but we honestly don't know how, at least at GBBO we don't know. Some people in these local areas might know, but we really don't know how well the patterns we see with Pinyon Jays in terms of habitat use in the Great Basin in Nevada in particular, how well those are paralleled in places where there are no pinyon pines. It's an open question. It's a great question, and that will be part of a larger area species conservation plan when some of that information does get put together. But I don't have an answer. I'd love to hear a good answer to that and look forward to when time goes by.
Yeah. Okay. Lot of questions coming in now. Dan Yarbo says he is west of Bishop and have had more visitors locally in recent months. Might that correlate with my reduction in sightings?
With the reduction in what?
I'm assuming a reduction in Pinyon Jay sightings, maybe more visitors, visitors.
More people visitors. Yeah, it's an open question how Pinyon Jays react to human presence and disturbance. I mean, certainly we have studied flocks that become used to people and will visit feeders, for instance. We have studied other flocks that have not been exposed to that kind of human presence and appear to be much shyer. They're harder to catch. So I suspect it's sort of like with a lot of species, you have some particular flocks or some particular subsets of the population that have kind of adapted themselves better to the human presence than others. But certainly if people get in the face of one of these wilder Pinyon Jay flocks, their sentinel birds know it, and the flock is very aware of you. And so there's could potentially be things like that going on.
Sean Golightly says, how do we explain Pinyon Jay's preferences for caching in lower density areas? That's the first question. And then the second question is, I've heard that there are some areas where Pinyon Juniper forest is expanding into ponderosa forest. What do you know about this?
So the first question, there are hypotheses about that. I don't know that anybody's proven, but there's a body of thought about coevolutionary adaptation among seed dispersers and seed plants. So, if both the seed disperser, the Pinyon Jay, and the seed plant, the pinyon pine, are doing well and sort of evolutionarily hit on a strategy that works well for both of them, that tends to be preserved. Obviously, a pinyon pine seed has a better chance of germinating and becoming a grown-up pinyon pine in a relatively open area than it does in a relatively dense closed area. There have been some arguments made that the microsite characteristics for the preservation of seeds as cache food items might be better in some of those shrubland areas, but there's not a definitive answer that I'm aware of. There have been people who've more generally worked on these seed dispersing birds, and there is a body of literature out there about the kind of the coevolutionary dance between the seed plant and the dispersers, which has, you can extend those sorts of answers speculatively to Pinyon Jays, but beyond that, that's what we're doing a little bit, is speculating. And then as far as extension of Pinyon Juniper into ponderosa pine areas, I don't personally know much about that, so I can't provide you with much insight about that.
Yeah, I haven't come across anything about that over the past few days. Cam Collins said they haven't heard the words West Nile much lately. Do you have any insight on potential ongoing impacts of this or other diseases on Pinyon Jay population trends?
Another good question. I have not heard West Nile virus personally. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I haven't heard West Nile virus mentioned in the same sentence or paragraph with Pinyon Jays before. So I don't know if there's any documentation of potential impacts over time. That said, I certainly haven't dug into the literature on West Nile virus to see if there's any reference to Pinyon Jay susceptibility. So I'm afraid I can't shed much light on that, but it's another good question. As I mentioned in the talk, there's a lot we don't know about all species, but Pinyon Jays stand out a little bit compared to some of the birds that are easier to study, your typical migratory songbirds. We're sort of catching up with Pinyon Jays.
Yeah, it seems a complicated bird to study. I mean, given just the their life histories and also the difficulty in capturing them. I know GBBO has had a hard time getting them in hand.
Yeah, well, we have success, but we have to work for it.
Yeah. John Dunn says, how does the science hold up or not in the Marsliff and Balda 1992 from your research?
Which specific part of that? I can't dredge up exactly what part of Marsliff and Balda. I mean, we've cited that paper obviously in the Pinyon Jay conservation strategy.
I'm not. Yeah, well, we'll give John a minute to respond. This specific.
Did a lot of the Balda work, and I don't know if this gets at what the question was really aiming at, but a lot of the work done by Balda and his partners and his students in Arizona focused on, you know, a relatively small number of flocks that were really intensively studied, and there was, you know, amazing stuff that came out of that as far as behaviors and social organization and that sort of thing. But from the perspective of broader region habitat use, it wasn't necessarily a particularly large sample. So it's possible that some of the patterns seen in that work were not necessarily representative of the broader range of the bird. But again, yeah, if it can be clarified which particular element we're talking about here, that would help me.
Well, we don't have any other questions in the interim. I guess you maybe answered John's question with that. Oh, here we go. The entire monograph, just curious. Also curious about major flights to places like West Texas every few decades.
There are these sometimes anecdotes, sometimes observations about eruptive movements of Pinyon Jay flocks or major movements of Pinyon Jay flocks. I'll tell one short story about something we have directly documented. It's not quite at the scale, perhaps, of what's being referred to in the question, the spatial scale, but it is notable. We had a flock that we studied with radio telemetry in southern Idaho a number of years ago, and it, you know, when we tagged those birds, I believe it was in the late summer or maybe early fall, probably late summer, and the home range of these birds was in all juniper woodland. There were not any Pinyon Jays within the activity areas where we saw that bird. And when pinyon nut harvest time rolled around, we suddenly started to find that flock completely absent from what we thought was its home range for several hours every day. And we drove around with our antennas, and eventually, after a week or two, we found where those birds were flying. They were commuting about 16, 17 miles every day to what turned out to be the nearest sizable stand of pinyon pine trees, and they were stuffing themselves with pine nuts. I don't know if we ever got information about whether they were caching them there or carrying, you know, a crop full back, but they were going down there every day to harvest pine nuts, and then they were returning to their home range. So they were making a daily commute of about 17 miles during pine nut harvest season to take advantage of that resource. So if they can do that, clearly they're capable of long movements, perhaps on a daily basis, perhaps on a seasonal basis, perhaps on an annual basis. The general pattern we've seen is that flocks tend to like to sort of do the same thing, you know, travel the same route within their home range on a day-to-day basis. But that can change seasonally, and of course, on rarer occasions, you can have these major movements.
John B. Free asks, will there be more studies in the future in and around Baker and GRBA?
There's nothing immediately slated. We are in the wake of having this conservation plan, the Pinyon Jay Working Group Conservation Plan come out. Our hope is that in Nevada, as is occurring in other surrounding states, that will generate a kind of a new pulse of interest in gathering more data on these birds. So stay tuned.
Any other questions before we move on to citizen science? These were all really good questions.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Oh, one more. You mentioned that all the pines have seeds about every 10 years. Will the jays move to places they usually aren't to take advantage of these extra seeds?
Well, given what I just described, that they're willing to fly 17 miles to get seeds, it makes sense that they will do what's necessary to take advantage of good mast years. But again, another question, we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about those movements and what a typical strategy is for taking advantage of the seeds that are available in the landscape of these birds. We've got good information about the movements of a number of flocks, but that's a long way from being able to say, to make robust generalizations about Pinyon Jay strategies for seed gathering. That there's a lot yet to be determined. But they're adaptable. They appear to be adaptable birds. They're willing to move. They're smart. They probably remember things at the individual or perhaps even the flock level for a number of years. So I won't be surprised to find out they do all sorts of complicated things to harvest food.
Great. Well, thanks so much, John. It was nice seeing all the work that GBBO has been doing. If nobody else has any questions, we will move on to citizen science. As John mentioned, we very much need a lot of data, and so we are asking for your help. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so GBBO this year is starting a citizen science campaign. We've had the Survey123 app active for a while now, but now we're really trying to start collecting a lot of information. Some of you may have seen data that you've collected on that slide that John showed of some of the points of data collection across Nevada. But this year we're starting as soon as we can. You can go to our website, the citizen science section, gbbo.org/citizen science, to read more about the project and sign up for updates. You can also check out our YouTube channel, which will have additional training materials. You can download Esri Survey123 and then record data. So we are focusing on data collection mostly with Survey123 because it's a really easy method to get good data out in the field. It's free to download on any device and anyone can use it without having a user ID. It can be used with or without internet connectivity, and it doesn't take up much storage space on a device. It's very small, I think something like 6 megabytes or something when you go to download it. So the very first step you would want to do is download Survey123. And for anyone that's not familiar with how to download something on a mobile device, you use Google Play or the Apple Store, which pretty much come preloaded on every mobile device out there. Second, you would access the Pinyon Jay survey form using either this arcgis/0CONER link, which on our website, this link is active, so it's a lot easier to click the link. But for those of you that are interested right now and want to do it, you can see this block of dots, black and white dots. Basically, it's a QR code that you can scan by taking a photo of it with your smartphone device. And I will leave it on for the next couple slides just in case anyone wants to do that now. It's also available on the website. And this automatically downloads the form on your device for future uses. You do have to do this while you have internet. You have to download the form with internet. Then you can collect data anywhere, which helps GBBO understand their distribution and habitat use. And this can be done anytime Pinyon Jays are observed or to collect absence data. So you might just be out birding, happen to notice Pinyon Jays and want to record that location, or you might be, out with your family or even eating at a restaurant and for some reason you see a flock of Pinyon Jays fly over and want to record that. If you do want to collect absence data, we ask that you spend at least 20 minutes for the birds to be considered absent, just because, you know, that's sort of, I don't know if it's an arbitrary amount of time, but it's just enough time to say that the birds are not in that location. So if you do go to that website or use that QR code to open the website, this is what you're going to see. This open in browser, open Survey123 app. If you've already downloaded the 123 app, you're just going to click right here, and that opens the field app and it opens the form automatically. This also gives you the opportunity, obviously I have an Android, so it says if you don't have the Survey123 field app, please download it first, get it on Google Play. If you have an Apple, it'll probably use the Apple Store. So then this form pops up, and it's pretty self-explanatory how to fill in the survey form. You will select an affiliation, such as member of the public, or if you happen to be doing surveys with us through a partner organization, you can select that. It goes through name, date, time. When you do sign in for the first time, it's going to ask you if you want to allow the application to access your location, and you have to say yes if you want it to accurately collect data. So you will select various attributes, type of record, if Pinyon Jays are present or absent, and then it also gives you the opportunity to take photos on the form. We ask that you take photos in the 4 cardinal directions, which is ideal to get an idea of the landscape. And you can add photos from your camera if you decide, or just take active photos right at the time. Here's some other data that we are requesting, such as different behaviors. And then on our YouTube channel, we will have a tutorial on how to identify some of these behaviors. Flying over, you would expect, if you just see birds flying over and don't see them on the ground or utilizing the habitat at all, that would be considered a flyover. You might see them foraging on the ground or in shrubs or in trees, or they might just be resting in trees, caching, as we talked about earlier, nesting, roosting, other. Some of the other important things, distance to flock is just an estimate. I know sometimes it's really difficult to estimate distances if you don't do it on a daily basis, but your best estimate is always better than a guess that we are having. Same with bearing to flock. If you don't have a compass, you can estimate that based on direction, northeast, southwest. If you're not really sure, you can always add comments and say, like in this example, someone wrote north, northeast as a comment. When you're done, you're able to hit submit survey, and that goes directly to us, and all the data will be updated. If you do sign up for updates for the Pinyon Jay Citizen Science, we will send updates as when we get them, you know, on a somewhat regular basis. If you don't have service at the time, you can always save it in your outbox and then submit it as soon as you have Wi-Fi. So we are appreciative to everyone in advance for helping with this. As John mentioned, there's so much information out there that we don't know. So getting an idea of where these birds are in the landscape really helps us out. And you saw there in the map, there are some areas that are hot spots that Pinyon Jays are regularly occurring. And then there are areas that either they're not predicted or we don't normally see them, but that doesn't mean they're not there. So it's always good to get information kind of everywhere. So here's a little bit more information. Like I said, you can go to our website, and that is where you can subscribe to the Pinyon Jay Citizen Science mailing list. You can get detailed instructions on Survey123 and print them out and have access to them. There's also that QR code right there. And you can learn more about GBBO's Pinyon Jay research. Also, there's a link to that paper that John mentioned earlier in the presentation, if anyone is interested and wants to find that, the Pinyon Juniper paper that came out. this year, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or,
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And please let us know if there are any questions. But until then, thanks.